Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. And I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. You can learn more about them at consumerscu.org. So Brian, let's start off today talking about redistricting. There's been some challenges to redistricting, and those challenges have gained a little bit of traction lately. So why don't you give us an update? And you've also brought some visual aids for this part of the conversation.
Yeah, so I've got maps, legislative district maps, but keep in mind when we talk about drawing lines, there's three different types of maps and district lines that are drawn every 10 years. Congressional districts, and then the House and the Senate at the state level. So I've got the House and the Senate at the state level. This one here is the Senate, and the one behind me here is the House. And thanks to our friends at Grassroots Midwest that printed those up for us last year. And I've even got anchor weights at the top there, which is my dictionary and my thesaurus, which I've always had a dictionary and thesaurus ever since people used to use those things. Before everything went online, and I just can't part with them. I keep them, and I'm glad that they're getting put to use today. Anyway, there are challenges. You know, we've talked a lot about redistricting, and these lines have big ramifications. You know, who gets elected, the way they draw the lines makes a big difference about who is elected. And this is the first time that it was done by a Citizens Redistricting Commission. So people were randomly chosen, and then they had to fit certain criteria of partisan, certain Republicans, Democrats, independents that are all kind of represented. They drew maps. And they had different criteria they considered in drawing maps, but they made a really, really big change. And they determined that essentially the state constitutional amendment essentially superseded the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so they were able to kind of set aside the traditional interpretation of limitations or requirements of the Voting Rights Act, and kind of created their own criteria. Technically speaking, what they did was reinterpret the Federal Voting Rights Act to make it fit how they wanted to draw the maps here in Michigan. Here's where that went awry, and you might recall I said a year ago the direction that they're going down. They were definitely gerrymandering the maps with a political intent to make the maps more kind of evenly distributed between Republicans and Democrats, and they had to gerrymander the maps to do that, ironically. But there's so when people complained and they said these aren't good maps, be that as it may, and really they're not. There's a lot of reasons why these maps make little sense in terms of keeping communities together and good and fair representation. But they weren't illegal, except for one thing, and that is in areas where you have high populations or significant populations of citizens who are minorities. That the Voting Rights Act says that you must maximize the number of districts. You must maximize the number of districts that have a majority of minority voters. Okay, so the way that this has always been interpreted in the past was that it stopped the right and the left from abusing minority populations for their own political interests. So if you have to maximize the number of majority-minority districts, it means that you can't pack in, so they call it pack and crack. So you can't pack in minorities all into just a few districts so that they don't have numbers in the overall legislative process. But you also can't spread them out so thin and that's the crack part, crack them up. You can't spread them out so thin that they don't have a chance of getting elected. And so the way that you do this is that when you maximize the number of majority-minority districts, it's that it kind of lands in the middle. And it was very, very clear when they put these maps out before that the number of Black legislators in the legislature and in Congress from Michigan would go down. That was an absolute guarantee, and it came true. In fact, it went down by about 20%, so a pretty significant decline. And so there is a challenge. And yesterday there was a press conference among current and former legislators and activists from Detroit in particular that are really dissatisfied with these maps and how they turned out. And I would point out, just as an example, over here in the Senate maps in Southeast Michigan, if you're to look, and I'm not going to carry the computer over to make everybody dizzy, but there are districts, particularly like District 10 and District 11, where there's these long pillar districts, and the pillar districts were designed such that they could take some of the Detroit population and put them with suburban communities in Oakland and Macomb counties to increase the likelihood of having more Democrats get elected, but decrease the likelihood that those Democrats would be black. And that is a big part of the challenge here, is that the Redistricting Commission said, yeah, but the other maps favored Republicans too much. This corrects it by breaking up Detroit into a bunch of pieces. Sure, you don't have as many legislators from Detroit, but you get more Democrats, so everybody wins. Like, that's how they looked at it. And so naturally people from Detroit are saying, wait a minute, no, that's not people from the suburbs representing Detroit in the legislature and in Congress is not the same thing, even if they're of the party that Detroit normally elects. And so this reinterpretation of the Voting Rights Act is really what is kind of at the heart of it. What the Redistricting Commission said, it's okay to have to take away the majority, the districts have a majority of minority voters. It's okay to do that as long as there's still a significant minority population. So they changed it from majority minority population to significant. So if it's like a third, that's significant. Well, but a third, when you put like a third of Detroit together with places like Royal Oak and Grosse Pointe or whatever, I mean, there's the chances that you're going to get a legislator from Detroit are a lot less if it's only a third. And so that's really at the heart of this. Now, there are conservative organizations that are pretty that don't like the maps too, maybe for other reasons. But here's the part that I think is most interesting. As this goes up, I do expect this will end up at the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, not our state Supreme Court. And the reason I think it will end up there is because in this case you have, while it's a Citizens Redistricting Commission, it was definitely a stated goal to say, hey, the other maps lean too much toward Republicans. We're going to try to draw these so that it leans more toward Democrats to make it more fair. So while they're violating the Voting Rights Act here in order to, there's my words, violating, but I think they really are, and I think there's a lot of credibility to this case. They're doing it to try to help Democrats. There are other states where people violate the Voting Rights Act, or there's questions of violation, to help Republicans. And so what you see kind of converging here are different interests from across the political spectrum and from across the country. And at the heart of it is this issue that if the Supreme Court allows Michigan to do what Michigan did in drawing these maps, the consequence of that would be that the same thing that's used to dilute the minority voter interests in the legislature and the chances of getting elected, the same when Republicans do it in other states, it would make that legal too. So that's why I think it's not likely that our Supreme Court is going to say, hey, in order for Michigan to be able to do what it's doing and diluting the influence of black voters in particular, diluting their influence in the legislature and Congress, even if it's to help one side of the political aisle for other reasons that the whole Redistricting Commission was built around, that they're not going to open up a lane for Republicans in other states to do the same thing, to use it to their own devices. So my guess is that at the end of the day, the traditional interpretation of the Voting Rights Act will stand. That it will be something that, if I were betting money, I'd give it even odds that these maps do not make it through to the next census. That, at least in part, would have to be redrawn. Now, if it's all in Southeast Michigan, there could be ripple impacts where you change it here and it makes it so you have to change it further out. I think it's very unlikely that that a requirement to redraw the maps in Southeast Michigan will result in significant changes in other places. But I could be wrong about that. We'll see. So we'll follow this really closely. Very, very interesting case, and one that I think will have ramifications not just here in Michigan, but in other places where the other political party has tried to use the map drawing to their advantage. And the Supreme Court at the end of the day, I think, will have the final say.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Supreme Court. We follow cases that impact our members, including those about regulatory environment. So you said there's one particular case of interest right now. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, they are taking up the powers of regulatory agencies and how much discretion they have to make rules that aren't explicitly allowed in the law. So if we were to go back to, the three branches of government and what we learned in civics class in school, it's like the legislature makes the law, the executive branch administers the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. So those are the traditional interpretations. But really, all three of those branches make law now. In the courts, there's a term for it. It's called case law. And in the regulatory agency, it's called rulemaking. They'll take a law and they'll make rules around it. How far can they go? How much leeway do they have without the law specifically saying what they can do? There was a case, it was called the Chevron difference back in 1984, where the Supreme Court said when Congress leaves it vague, when Congress leaves something vague, that regulatory agencies have the ability, the authority to fill in the blanks. And that has been kind of a bone of contention, like how far can you go when something is not spoke to in a law? Is it carte blanche, and you can go as far as you want in terms of the regulatory agency making rules. That particular decision from 1984 will be up for review. And given the ideological split on the court today and the kind of a libertarian leaning that is more prevalent on the Supreme Court today than has been certainly during my lifetime, I would say there's a pretty decent chance that 1984 precedent will be at least modified, but maybe overturned. In other words, that regulatory agencies would need to be able to justify their actions in the future more than they have to today in terms of showing here's where we're authorized in the law. So to do whatever it is that they're doing. So that's, don't know exactly when that decision would be out, but I mean, that's one that's up in this term. And as they move forward, I think it's a fair bet that particular precedent will be modified in some way. It's not out of the question that it'd be overturned outright. Ultimately, I do think that it would be a lot of disruption if they were to say that regulatory agencies had no ability to kind of put details behind vague laws passed, but at this point they have a lot of leeway, and I think that probably at least some boundaries will be put in place as we go through. So of all the business issues before the Supreme Court, that's the one I'm watching most closely, and the one that I think could potentially have the biggest impact on the business climate here in the United States.
All right, let's bring it back to state politics, where we have a compromise and a new insurance mandate that is likely to make it to Governor Whitmer's desk. What do our members need to know?
Yeah, there's now insurance mandates in Michigan don't pass very often. And there's one that's been kind of working its way through the process for a couple of terms now. And it's a mandate of coverage and limits on copays for oral chemotherapy. And the reason that this one became such an issue is because if you know much about your health plans and how they work, you've got medical care and then you got prescription coverage. In the case of chemotherapy, intravenous chemotherapy is something that is done previously, like in a hospital setting. It's been medical care. It's not considered to be a pharmacy benefit. Your copays and deductibles and coverages for pharmacy benefits are different than the medical care. So what happened was when very expensive new drugs for oral chemotherapy made it possible for people to take chemotherapy at home instead of going in for intravenous treatment, it was subject to prescription drug coverage limitations, not regular medical care. And so what this legislation seeks to do is create some parity for this in particular thing, for this particular treatment, to say that there are limits on copays and deductibles on oral chemotherapy that are kind of independent of the pharmacy benefit, to treat it more like the medical side of the insurance house. So the original bill, as it went through, has been modified. The copay limitations were changed, and also the implementation of it. Again, I don't expect people to be experts on insurance, but a lot of the process for how rates are determined for the previous year, those are all, or for the next year, those have already passed. The actuarial work for rate setting for next year is already passed. So they did delay implementation until the following year. So it wouldn't be until 2025 that these changes would be in effect, as opposed to the 2024 calendar year. So that's working its way through the process. It's very likely this fall to hit the governor's desk, and then of course you will sign it. So there's in terms of coverage, there will be a new or change in the coverage of all insurance policies, or at least all state regulated insurance policies carry in the future.
All right, it's been a while since we've had an update on the U.S. Senate seat here in Michigan that, Senator Stabenow is not going to run for re-election. So why don't you give us an update?
Yeah, there's so on both sides of the aisle, you've got among the Democrats, kind of the leading contender that most people view to be the leading contender, Alyssa Slotkin. In Congress, she has been a prolific fundraiser that has continued into the Senate race. She announced ahead of the campaign finance filing that's due here shortly that she yet again raised $3 million in this quarter. So really big fundraising performance, because keep in mind, she's working on a primary here. This is not for the general election. She's still got to win a primary. Those are some big and impressive numbers to be raising, and so she got about $5 million on hand. But she raised about $3 million before in her first quarter since announcing. So she's got a whole campaign, apparatus up and running. So she does seem to be in a very commanding position, even though there is opposition. There are other people running on that side of the aisle. Now, among the Republicans, there was a state Board of Education member, Nikki Snyder, that got into the race pretty early, the first one, I think, in the race. And there are some names that I'm not familiar with that have filed as well. But the big ones, the big changes since we've last covered this, Mike Rogers got into the race, former member of Congress from the Livingston County area, like the Brighton area. He had retired out of Congress, now coming back to run for Senate. And he'll be a very serious candidate for the race. And then James Craig, the former chief of police in Detroit, you might recall, was running for governor. And then there was a case where signature gatherers defrauded several candidates, including him. And so he had intended to run for governor, but didn't because of that. The signature firm that committed fraud against several candidates. He's just one of the victims of that. So he is now in the race for United States Senate. So those two very legit candidates. So I would say that it's shaping up to be a real race. With as close as the United States Senate is, this being an open seat and a seat that really hasn't been an open seat in a long time. The Savanaugh seat has not been open in a very long time. This is likely to be one that has a lot of focus on it. So other candidates next week we'll see kind of how everybody did, but usually when a candidate is particularly proud and they know they're in a commanding position, they'll announce it ahead of time so they get some splash that's not mixed in with everybody else's fundraising results. And yet again, Alyssa Slotkin comes out in a very commanding position.
All right, let's kind of switch gears here altogether and talk about a little COVID update. And that is that the CDC is no longer printing COVID-19 vaccination cards.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people keep a little book or a vaccination record and for a little while there was like a separate card just for COVID, and that the CDC was printing, and it was meant to be something like, when people wanted to see, you might have to. You go to a concert, sometimes like you'd have to show the card, or you're traveling to another country and you have to show the card and the proof. But this is like one of these tail end things where, another sign that the pandemic part of this process, COVID-19 will be a seasonal, likely be a seasonal thing moving forward, but but the pandemic part is over, and the CDC not kind of singling it out anymore for a special vaccination record or card apart from just the regular vaccination records would be a pretty good indication of that. One of the last remaining remnants, if you will, of the pandemic era has been put to bed.
All right, and then finally, let's get an update on the UAW strike.
Yeah, the UAW did do a counter offer to General Motors. It really wasn't clear if they were doing counter offers up until now. We knew that they were rejecting offers from the automakers because Mr. Fain, the president of the UAW, would hold the offers like over the trash. So I mean, we knew that that there were offers were going one way, but it does look like there are two-way offers, and maybe meaningful two-way offers. So that's something, a little indication that things are inching forward. But honestly, aside from that, there's not really a lot of reason to think that there are that they're like close to a deal. What we know about the automakers' offers are the sorts of offers that in previous contract negotiations would have been unheard of, how big the increases that are being put on the table. The last week, the union did expand their strike, and it is starting to cause some more ripple impacts. So the automakers have started to lay people off that are not on strike as a result of those that are on strike. So it's a supply chain, and sometimes these people go on strike, then others can't do their work. And so we're seeing those show up in hundreds of employees. It's over 25,000 now, direct employees, not to speak of suppliers, not to speak of those that indirectly would be impacted, but those direct UAW workers that are out now, 25,000 nationwide. So that's not an insignificant number, and it's one that I thought I'd also cover. Let me take a quick look at it here. There was an estimate put out by the Anderson Economic Group about the cost so far of this strike, and so like General Motors had to do an SEC, when they did their SEC filing, one of the things they had to do is disclose costs of the strike. So they disclosed a $200 million direct cost. But in terms of like lost wages, so that's the cost of General Motors. What about the overall economic cost? That's what the or the Anderson Economic Group tried to estimate. So $325 million in direct wages lost to people that are either on strike or laid off as a result of the strike. A little over $1 billion in earnings from General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. So, it's not like when the strike ends, everything just pops back in place, that there'll be a longer term earnings hit. And then $1.29 billion in supplier wages and earnings. So again, it's not just these three automakers, it's an entire supply chain. And then $1.2 billion in lost revenue to auto dealers. It almost comes to $4 billion. That's the estimated cost. That's the sort of thing that led, the other day when the governor, who's been very supportive of striking workers and went to the picket lines to show that support. But the governor, I think, has expressed yesterday and that she's very concerned about the economic impact of this strike, and it's because of numbers like that. The longer term ramifications are significant, and they will continue to mount. And the longer that the strike continues, and the broader that it gets, not only will it have a bigger impact, kind of like the initial economic impact gets bigger and bigger, but the length of time to get back to normal, the length of time it will take to get back to zero, if you will, it gets longer the longer they're on strike. So this is the sort of thing that's happening. And the backdrop of all this is a lot of recessionary signs that are starting to show up across the landscape. So this is like a pile-on almost to it that could end up being a little more costly in the long run for everybody involved than what it might seem on its surface, even though on its surface it seems pretty big in and of itself.
All right, this is kind of a hard pivot from some not so great economic news, but I do want to let everyone know we have quite a few events coming up the latter half of October, including webinars on smart marketing on a budget and a cybersecurity roundtable led by former Governor Rick Snyder. We also have a special VIP and elite member luncheon coming up October 24th, featuring Brian and 2 Michigan Supreme Court justices. So check out sbam.org/events and see which ones might fit in your schedule. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll be back here on Monday.
See you on Monday, everybody.